Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm joining you. And I've created a bit of a streak with the podcast. I've been nailing episodes recently, creating a backlog, and recording some of the best podcasts that the weightlifting, sport performance, strength sport scene has seen in a very long time. And we're going to continue that today. With the guest who has done a ton of incredible work in the sport performance and in weightlifting sectors, has coached at a very high level, has gone through the academic rigmarole of getting a, professional degree. So Shyam, how are we doing today?
Very well, thank you, Josh. Thanks again for your kind words and inviting me on to speak.
Yeah, and we've done a previous episode of the podcast for people who haven't listened to it and would like a bit of a refresher. They can go back in the archives and search that. It was incredible. It was an incredible show. And today we wanted to take those kind of more blanket aspects, the general aspects of sport performance, and kind of narrow them a bit more. Do a few things you've been working on publishing lately. You put out a case study centered around competitive weightlifting, which is fantastic, and totally in line with the podcast. And then you have also been doing some work looking at trunk strength and, relationships relationships to performance. And of course, I don't want to butcher it, so I speak really vaguely about it. That way, I'm not wrong, and I hope you can kind of take the torch and kind of run with it. To start, let's kind of explore the paper that's already been published. So if people haven't read it, I'll link it down below. But could you just kind of talk about the idea, in its inception, how it was eventually written up, and kind of the findings you were able to take away from it?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was actually very rarely, I think you'd hear people say this, but this was actually a very personal publication to me that I hold very close to my heart. And I wanted to kind of share that story. And so it was based on, I'm sure I could say the name now, because if you search the performance total, you'll pick up who it is very quickly. So it was based on Cyril Chachet, who at the time was part of the refugee Olympic team. And that was the first refugee weightlifter that was presented at the Olympic Games. So, I've had the honor of coaching him for coming up a decade nearly.
Wow.
And part of my role with him was also being a sports scientist, not just his personal coach. And a lot of the testing came from me just being really curious. So, this is someone who's got an incredible story, an incredible background. I mean, if you just Google him, they're pretty, they'll tug on the heartstrings for sure. So giving him this opportunity to experience high performance setting with just the two of us was a really cool opportunity, but also for me to learn. And it started with just like your basic testing of jumps, isometric, etc. And this then became something we did regularly in preparation for competitions to help drive our programming, but also to kind of guide me and not let me be too anecdotal with my approach. So it kind of held me accountable as well. And then COVID hit. At the time, he was a dual career athlete, so he was actually a nurse. So he was working over COVID while also preparing for the games, which we were unsure about him actually going to because nothing was really confirmed until I think July time. So very June, July, which was very close to the games. And essentially, the paper just takes you through how training was administered and adapted pre-COVID, how we utilize testing and monitoring and volume load distributions to improve total performance, then how we adapted it during COVID. So, making it more about general prep as opposed to being specific
Mm.
because of accessibility, and how monitoring and training monitoring just stopped then because of accessibility. And then post COVID, where it's like, okay, we're going to the games.
Mm.
What do we have access to? We're going to travel along these time frames where we're not going to have access to things like the force plates, etc. So what alternative could be utilized to make sure, your taper goes really well?
Mm.
And essentially, it was just my way of trying to contribute to the scientific community using a case study on a high performing athlete, which there aren't many, particularly longitudinally, with a story which isn't so linear and clean.
Mm.
I mean, no sport is, but this one in particular had definitely had some barriers.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful to provide a little context, 'cause I've seen him lift. He's incredible weightlifter. What are his best numbers? And then, I would love to kind of further dissect a bit more of, your thoughts behind the training and the monitoring process. And we'll get into that. But as far as, what his best performances are, best numbers, just so people have a context. 'Cause when you say, when we say elite, like, yeah, he's elite. He's very, very good.
Yeah, so back then, so looking at 2019, actually, I think, is the first reported um, competition in that paper. So at that time, he was about a 150, 190 at
Mm.
96 body weight. And then we got into 160, 200 when he moved up a category. And yeah, he's kind of floated around that. So at this current point, so at the world champs, it was 162 and 203, I believe,
Mm.
at 110. So he's gone up in body weight a little bit. And
Yeah.
he's been lifting a long time, since he was a young teenager. So
Mm.
to still make improvements at this age with this training age is pretty impressive, but only testament to the hard work he puts in.
Oh, yeah, of course. And I think you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like I saw him snatch 170 from the blocks
Yeah.
recently. Whew, that's three
Yeah.
reds. That's impressive.
Yeah. He's very good at what he's good at. Um, so yeah, he's incredibly strong. And I think
Mm.
that's one of the things I started to learn very quickly. And when I start looking at like force time curves, it's almost like his rate of force development is out of this world.
Mm.
So not only does he have a huge capacity, but when you look at his force time curve, the the initial starting point up it's almost vertical.
Wow.
Um, but yeah, we've seen a few cases of that within the national team. But that was it's a very interesting time, very challenging time for me as a coach and as a sports scientist. But also away from the sports science side, like how you manage an athlete as well. I think I learned a hell of a lot
Mm.
about that as well. And yeah, he did very well. Finished 10th, which
Mm.
he wanted and he was happy with. So yeah,
Yeah, that's fantastic. A testament to the work both of you put in. And I'm sure like the
thank
entire
you.
support team and everyone affiliated has just, given a lot. As far as, kind of, having a reflective moment on the preparation,
Mhm.
um, what do you feel like you did well? And maybe you learned from the process, because as a coach, I, want to, my instinct is to say, like, let me see the training, like, let me see everything he did, like his training log, let me look at it. And that way I can kind of look at exercises and patterns and, how you kind of laid all that out, which is useful for me. But I think for everyone listening, What were some of your big takeaways of what you did well during that preparation that people could probably learn from and maybe benefit from implementing?
Yeah, I've never really thought of what I've done well because I think we're always very self-critical,
Yeah.
right? Um, yeah, put me on the spot here a little bit. I think adapting was
Mm,
one of them and putting the athlete first. It sounds so cliche and it's probably something that everybody would say, and I don't think it's groundbreaking whatsoever. But the athlete has to come first, and he played a very big part in how the programming was structured and how it was adapted. So we'd often talk about, right, what worked well in the last block, what didn't, why, what are the negotiables and what are the non-negotiables.
mm,
The negotiables are he, let's say he preferred a certain movement, or let's say actually a certain movement hurt him or made him feel some discomfort. Okay, let's find the best alternative. The non-negotiable would be, well, the data suggests this,
mm,
so this is the exercise we're going to use to try and move that data point up. That would be the non-negotiable. So I think adapting and having boundaries with each other as well, with the negotiables and non-negotiables, really helps, and making sure they're part of that decision making, because that way they're more invested with what they're going to do. Because at the end of the day, they're the one that's going to go in the gym for
mm.
2 hours
Yeah.
and train 6 times in a week.
Yeah. I think, as coaches, we find patterns, um, just kind of through observation in the training of our athletes. You kind of watch, one athlete carry out a plan, and you kind of find like the peaks and the troughs, and then you might say, okay, there might be something there. Let's see if other people hit on a similar pattern when we try that style of training. And then you implement it again, and you're like, okay, this consistently works relatively well, like utilizing these exercises, these rep ranges, this like type of loading. And then you're like, okay, I'll put that in my back pocket, use this consistently to have some sort of like a system that can kind of
Mm.
repeat across time and be improved on. Do you feel like there were any patterns you picked up on either exercise selection or kind of the rep ranges used, but something you did where you're like, this works and this is something I'm going to hold on to?
Yes, definitely. Snatch grip RDLs,
Mm,
so
okay.
primarily posterior chain work.
Mm,
He's, like most weightlifters, incredibly anteriorly dominant. So as soon as you add some posterior chain work, I
mm,
feel that just unlocks their potential a little bit
yeah.
more. And that was something that he hadn't been exposed to very much of. So adding that just kind of got newbie gains from that, I suppose.
Nice.
From like a data perspective, the mid thigh pull, we use a block pull from mid thigh.
Mm, yeah.
And what we found every time, again, I can't say this with great confidence. I'm making an association here without the data supporting it because it is an N of one. So you can't make a generalized statement. However, what I did notice is when we started adding in the mid thigh block pull between 120 and 140, which some of the literature suggests improves impulse and peak force from that position.
Mm.
So Paul Comfort's work and Tim Sukumar's work. When we added that in, that's when his clean started to go up.
Oh, wow.
Now, I think that is a case of I had also identified, so if I put my coach's hat on, his second pull was good, but it was very kind of like hip dominant. So lead
Mm,
in with the hip as opposed to extend up. So this was actually a way of trying to get him to extend straighter more, to get more vertical ground reaction force. And one of the ways I thought we could try that is by adding that mid thigh pull in, and it seemed to have worked quite well. Now, like I said, I can't say that is the exact reason why that happened, and I can't say that's something we could add in again and it'll work again. However, back then and within this paper which I wrote, I feel like that was probably one of the exercises that helped for the clean for sure.
Yeah. And I think as a coach, you watch, one, when you have an athlete who's been training for a very long time, everything's relatively stable. And, as a coach who's been programming for them for a long time, you kind of understand how they're going to look just in general. So I think when you make a change like that and you say, okay, I think this had a pretty profound effect or like helped, you can have a little bit more confidence in that.
Agreed.
So the snatch grip RDL, I'm going to take that and start programming it because, I think it kind of goes along with what we're going to, to foreshadow the later part of the conversation.
Mhm.
We can isolate parts of the body. We can isolate, muscle groups. We can isolate, body parts, and we can target them and load them and change their like the ability of those muscles to produce force, but then to bring it all together, right? To create that like uh coordinated efforts, it
Yeah,
requires, a kind of a more global exercise that kind of challenges that, which I think a snatch grip RDL has that coordination aspect, and then it has a
yeah,
strengthening aspect, positional aspect. I've done a lot of clean grip, but I think getting the snatch grip would be beneficial. Um, because I think, yeah, in the snatch, people tend to open up really early, kind of start to pull the shoulders back. They don't get the knees to travel back quite as far as they could. And then everything just ends up being a little bit forward. So I think putting in those RDLs will help them kind of unlock that position. So I like that. And then thinking about the flip side of that question, which is what were some of the things you might have tried or wanted to do that may have not panned out? That, like, think about the next preparation, you'll maybe make some tweaks or adjustments there.
Ye yes, that's a great question. Actually, if I just go back one step, it's something that just popped to mind, where I feel like I've taken a hell of a lot of credit for saying, "Oh, I've added this mid-cycle in." But there's something that Cyril actually added in himself, and I kind of gave him free rein on
Mm,
this, and this was like the negotiable, um, and that was just a clean grip deadlift.
mm,
So he would tend to do that on a Saturday. So he would say to me, "Don't program any weightlifting stuff on a Saturday. Give me my accessories, but if I feel okay, I'm probably going to go heavy
mm.
on a clean grip deadlift." Now I think he got to something absolutely ridiculous. I think he got near like 300 kilos,
Oh my gosh.
but he goes, "That just made me feel like I could
Mm,
lift anything off the floor."
yeah.
And it's like, well, that makes absolute sense. And also, if you think about why that's not programmed so often and so heavy in weightlifters is because neuromuscular taxation is so high, it can be tapped.
Mm,
But he's regulated that himself. So he's gone, well, if I feel good, I might do it. If I don't, I'm not going to do it. And I think that might have had an effect. But again, it's just something which I remember him doing, and he still does to this day. So maybe not as much weight anymore. Not sure. Um, So, something which I'd like to have done more of is distribute the squatting a little bit differently.
mm,
And the reason I say that, there was a barrier, and the barrier was there was a bit of an adductor issue, which meant we couldn't back squat, we could only front squat. So I do wonder what it would have been like if we were
mm,
to use back squat more. Um, But yes, it's hard to tell. And I think what I could have done better would have been around the accessory work. So
mm,
about trying to keep him healthy. There was a bit of a wobble where around 12 weeks before traveling, the adductor was at a point where we're like, it could be a case of pulling out, which
mm,
imagine having to do that for your first Olympic Games.
yeah.
That'd be devastating. But we managed to get it under control. And bear in mind, at this point, it was COVID, so we didn't have access to anything. It was literally just me and him in the gym, six days a week. I think the only two people I I saw during that period for however many months was him and my partner. you know? Um, so yeah, that was, I think that's something I could have definitely done better to keep him in better health. Had I've had the knowledge that I have now, there would have been some changes for sure.
Yeah. Well, and you kind of mentioned that comment of, before about him implementing clean grip deadlifts. And, I think a great, coach athlete relationship is one where the athlete is like, hey, I think this might be a good adjustment. Try it out, because I coach someone, Matt, and he's good. He's like a 129, 128, 163 guy. And he started adding in jerks on one of his clean days, and his jerk looks way better. And, we've been doing a lot of more jerk specific work behind the neck stuff, just trying to
Mhm.
overload it. And he looks sharp. He looks really good. And he's like, I think that extra day of jerks really helped. I'm like, good, keep doing it. I won't program it. Just keep rolling with it. And I think, as an athlete myself, you kind of feel that intuitive aspect of like, this thing just really
Yeah.
feels like it's going to help. So I'm going to kind of roll with it. And I think that ability to have that trust, but also the athlete have some like internal knowledge of what is going to
Yeah.
work and what feels right, and be able to like kind of make that benefit their performance is kind of what you're hoping for.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you've touched on something there which is really important is just because you've got a good relationship doesn't mean they're automatically going to be good at making decisions. I
Mm,
think that's
yeah.
a lesson and a journey that occurs on on the way of developing a stronger relationship between a coach and an athlete. And even to this day, I still would let him lead the program.
Mm,
Like, right, we've got Euros coming up, got Commonwealth coming up. What's the plan? What do you think's worked well? What hasn't? Let's have a sit down. Let's have a chat. You lead me. But it wasn't always like that. And I think the interesting part, and this is something I've learned having worked with other athletes from other nations, coming from an African nation, had a very distinct way of lifting. Now, I have another lifter who was part of another national team, which is also uh, an African nation, and they lift very similar. Technically, probably not as efficient, but
mm,
incredibly powerful. I was like, well, maybe that's just the way they lift there. Now, how can we make it a little bit better without kind of tearing it down completely,
yeah.
and breaking that confidence? So then once you start having those discussions, there's going to be disagreements. Um, you start to find like a happy medium
Mm,
where there's things you start to accept and you work around that to help make them a better lifter. There's things they start to accept that they have trust in what you're doing, and it becomes this collaborative approach. But also, if you were to step away, or if, let's say, um, there's a period of time where the athlete has got lots of other commitments, like work or studying, for example. Maybe they don't want something really structured. Maybe they just want to go in the gym. When they go in the gym, they're going to make good decisions.
mm,
They're going to do exercises in a sequence that's going to help them at least maintain some level of performance. They're not going to max out every single day, but that's something again that is learnt over time, and it's something that I'm trying to do with like my club as well,
mm,
with lifters who are just recreational weightlifters. You know, a girl who has learned snatch, 12 weeks ago, can we help her make good decisions when she has to
mm,
go for a heavy double or a heavy
yeah.
triple?
Yeah.
Technically, is it good? Did this happen? Did that happen? And hopefully over time, kind of kind of make yourself redundant a little bit,
Yeah.
but they want you there and part of it
Mm.
because they trust your decision making and your guidance on the programming and your loading and your expertise.
Yeah. No, I think that's entirely true. And I think, um, uh, kind of what a good coach can add at some point, as you mentioned, is their presence. It's energy, it's, them being there and being able to collaborate. And I think that takes some attunement on the athlete, their ability to kind of like you know, accept the autonomy and say like, all right, yeah, you're right. I need to focus on these things, and they're very, very important. And I don't need to be coached up every rep to do it well or to do it better, from the start of the workout to the finish of the workout. And, as a coach, that takes a little bit off your plate, and then you can kind of let out a sigh of relief when like I wouldn't have to cue or coach everything for it to be perfect. I can watch the athlete take that kind of process into their hands and
Yeah.
then kind of run with it. Um, and then one thing I did want to kind of talk about, because the Power and Strength Summit, this is a second conference that's been held. It's kind of focused on, kind of like a grassroots setting, like a club, small operation, individual coach, performance scientist, someone who's wanting to start maybe at like a private facility. And Andrew Stewart's going to talk about, what he's learned from basically being in an elite kind of sports science setting and applying that to a grassroots position. And then you talking about that case study, you were the technical, tactical coach, the weightlifting coach, and the sports scientist.
Yeah.
What did you learn from a sports science standpoint of, in a weightlifter's, preparation? How can we utilize it effectively? Because, uh, you know, frankly, most of the people listening to this podcast are weightlifting coaches or powerlifting coaches. So I think they have this interest and hunger, this appetite for implementing, sports science related processes. And maybe they're just unsure where to start or how to start.
Yeah. Another good question there. Um, I mean, having an academic background helps, right? Because you've got a good starting point. But now I think a lot of the literature is available quite
Mm,
freely, especially on people's research gates. And like this resource in your podcast are fantastic source of information. And there's others as well, which you can get some good, solid information from. I think the first thing, at least for me, it was the curiosity.
mm,
I'm a curious person. Um, and if something works, I want to know why it works. If something doesn't work, well, I'm going to ask myself, why didn't it work? And let's look into it. And the the testing itself, I was very fortunate to have access to things like force plates. And at that point, I was only doing the mid thigh and counter movement jump.
mm,
Um, we also used the Anode sensor, which was called the VMAX Pro back then, to look at barbell velocity and also to add context to some of the technical cues and
mm,
technical challenges we were working on for both of us from a subjective and objective uh, standpoint. So there'd often be times where, how did that feel? Yeah, it felt really good. Oh, here's the iPad, here's the trajectory and the speed. Have a look. Why? So again, it's that learning process,
mm,
right? So I think the barrier of applying sports science to drive weightlifting programming or to better understand weightlifting, firstly, is going to be defined by what you have access to. Um, Force plates are pretty accessible now, but not everyone has them.
yeah.
Might be in a club setting where you don't have that luxury. And it is a luxury still. As much as you read in the papers, oh, it's highly available now. Like, yeah, it is if you've got $5,000 to spend, right? But also phone apps are really useful.
Mm,
You can get things like the My Jump app or the My Lab, I believe it's called now, where you can get jump height. You can get impulse as well, propulsive impulse. Um, and when you look at some of these measures, they relate highly to weightlifting
yeah.
performance. We've published some stuff on there, and there's been loads of stuff published prior to that as well. Um, and then relatively inexpensive equipment around like accelerometers, like I mentioned, the Anode. If you wanted to look at more technical measures, but you can also measure jumps and stuff with that. So that now adds another element of, well, I can use it to better understand the technical thumbprint of my athlete.
Mm,
I can view that subjectively, I can view it objectively. There's some fantastic papers on how you can use some of that information. Um, and also adds an element of velocity-based training as well.
mm,
So now you've got things like regulating squatting intensity, regulating pulls. Again, there's a couple of really good papers on how to use the pull to predict snatch performance.
mm.
So I think the first thing you got to think of is, what's my entry barrier? Have I got access to this equipment? If you don't have any of that, then I think keeping training logs and the stuff they do in the gym and using the ratios can be also informative as well. As long as you can map some of those ratios back to certain physical qualities, because that will then help you develop a more holistic program around it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think there's a lot for people to kind of chew on there in terms of potential resources, how they can implement it, and adapt their process. And I think as full-time coaches, they'll have the ability to take some of those ideas and try them out with individual athletes, and then say, okay, how could this work in a bigger group setting? So I thought that was like a fantastic recap of that recent paper you published. Again, linked in the description for people interested. Now we wanted to segue into some of the work that's not currently available for people to read, but I think has implications and will be kind of the foundation for the presentation you're going to give at the Power and Strength Summit, which again is January 24th and 25th, and just a lineup of Titan speakers unmatched. Sergey Putsov, Andrew Stewart, yourself, Steph Mock Grubbs, Guy Hornsby. I mean, like just like a star-studded cast, and really for the price, it's an absolute deal. So I'm super excited for it, and to learn more myself. So to kind of preempt your presentation, we wanted to talk about trunk strength and its relationship with lower body performance. And again, you know, at the risk of saying something wrong, I'd rather you describe it and kind of explain it. So maybe you can kind of did what we did before the podcast. You could talk about what was the question, what was the idea, how'd you attempt to understand it, and then what were the ways you went about that, and what did you find?
Yeah. So yeah, firstly, like it's a real honor to be speaking alongside those individuals. As a very cool opportunity, and congratulations and well done on getting that summit off the ground. It's going to be a great weekend. So yeah, very much looking forward to it. So I chose to do something a little bit different, which I haven't fully got the grasp of yet. And it's something I'm learning more and more about, but I definitely think is interesting, and hopefully presenting on trunk strength and its association with lower body performance will maybe give other people something to think about. Maybe they can come to me with some great ideas as well. But essentially, so my work with the national team is around the performance science. Part of it is around the performance science. And we developed a testing battery. So our testing battery includes positional isometrics, um, counter movement jump, and uh, barbell velocity profiling and technical velocity profiling. Now, this information is really useful because it helps us understand what potential physical qualities, general physical qualities need improving. But from like a rehab and injury perspective, we started to notice there was some reports of back pain.
Mm,
And when you look at like the literature from, God, I think some years back on uh, injury, not injury risk, but injury profiling within weightlifting, the back tends to be highly reported,
mm,
right? And I think there's some research from the States. I think that was done on the national team back in the either late 90s, I think. And there's also some stuff out of Indonesia, I believe, as well. When you look at people reporting back pain, it tends to be related to muscular strain,
Uh,
right? Now, when you think about strain, that's linked to overuse. So now we've got this um, link between back pain, very likely to be a muscular strain. Muscular strains tend to be linked to being overused. Okay, I'm not a rehabber, I'm not a physiotherapist, that's not my speciality whatsoever. So just pragmatically kind of thinking about that, I was like, well, reading around, when we're lifting weights above our head or we're getting to certain positions, the aim of the sport is to do that with as much weight as physically possible. So our trunk needs to be able to handle the demand of that movement and of that loading. So therefore, developing general robustness around the trunk is really important. So the thought was increase general robustness, maybe we get less reports of lower back pain. Reading around the literature, not always the case. So muscular strength in the trunk, measured by flexion, extension, and even lateral flexion, isn't necessarily associated with back pain. So that link kind of just blew up because pain is incredibly complex, come from varying different areas. The other part of it was also, well, we know that people need to hold certain positions at the knee, for example, in the set position. So when you look at the literature from, I think it was Garhammer back in 1980s, early 80s, he looked at the kinetic energy flow between different segments of the body. And what he found, the trunk segment in the first pull steadily increases during the snatch. And this was done in international weightlifters, right? And essentially, we also know as coaches, we need to preserve that early hip rise. So if that's my trunk and that's my hip, we don't want that kind of hip hike early. So what that tells us and what we know as weightlifting coaches is maintain your torso angle from the set to the first pull. Therefore, you need to use your legs. Okay, great. But we're connected to the bar via our arms, which is connected to our trunk. So is there an association between someone's trunk strength and their ability to generate force in the set position at the knee and at the mid-thigh? Because depending on what we find from looking at that association, we might be able to then add specific trunk exercises to increase the overall trunk strength that may have a beneficial effect on someone being able to use their lower body in those positions more effectively.
Yeah, it seems like a very well thought out, and it's interesting. I think this is why it's important to understand, read an entire paper, read an entire book, like listen to an entire idea. Because as you start talking through that, I'm like, okay, I have my own thoughts, and as you explain it and explain, I'm like, oh, those start to kind of like make more and more sense. The relationships start to seem more significant. So you detailed it really nicely. I think everyone listening is going to have a good sense of the starting point. What was then kind of the process of uncovering and establishing any potential relationships that could lead into saying, hey, in practice, this is kind of an approach you could consider, think about that could, potentially mitigate or manage more like lower back kind of pain experiences, it could create potentially more, allow for more force transfer through the appendages, through the legs, and hips, legs, hips, and allow the person to hold better positions through the pole, so that all of it can happen more kind of naturally or seamlessly as it's been described.
So I think the first thing was to accept that the lower back pain thing and the trunk thing may be too complex
Mm,
to say, look,
yeah.
if if we improve this, your lower back pain would definitely go away. Is not the case. We also had an assumption of ratio.
Mm,
Is is there an imbalance between flexion and extension that's causing you to have lower back pain? Um, and again, looking at some of the literature, the evidence just doesn't support it. So maybe it is overly complex for us
yeah.
to attach that to lower back pain. But as a coach that looks at movement, what you can do is you can start to break down someone's ability to coordinate their hip
Mm,
and their spine. So I think this is really common in recreational weightlifters or recreational athletes generally, right? Is anterior pelvic tilt.
mm,
So that kind of Kim K posture. Um, when we have an athlete and we're like chest up, often or not, they get this big anterior pelvic tilt instead. So it's like, okay, so something is happening that is stopping you from being able to hold neutral. Now,
mm,
if I want you to do an RDL, if I want you to do a deadlift off the floor, if I want you to do a hang clean, you need to be able to maintain a neutral posture, not just because it's going to help you transfer energy from the floor up through the chain, but also to protect your spine, which is
mm,
way more important. So that kind of teaching someone about the neutral position, I think is really important. Maybe this is something we can unpack in a little bit around like progressions and developing that. But once once an athlete's able to do that, now you can start thinking about loading and different exercises, right? And then in terms of like the sorry, was it around the training type around the trunk
yeah.
associated with the whole body?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we keep it relatively simple, I think an example I've used in the past is around the first pull or the set position
Mm,
in the set position. So let's say someone has a good ability to maintain a neutral spine. You've tested it using just a cat camel. They're very aware of their pelvis position and they can maintain that. Now, can that be integrated into something which is related to performance, which in this
mm,
instance is a set? If you have a good set position, then the rest of your lift is likely going to do well. And what we also know now is from a proxy's perspective, force generated in the set position has one of the best relationships with performance in weightlifting. We look at the impulse produced in the first pull by some of our work that Angela Sorensen had done. Impulse in the first pull, highest correlation to clean performance.
mm,
So it's important. We know that. So now that's where the transfer comes in. Neutral position of the spine. Can you do that? Yes. Let's get you in a set position. Let's now see if you can hold that position isometrically. Now we can start kind of moving you through the motions. Having said that, that doesn't mean you can't have somebody do a full snatch or clean and jerk.
mm,
But what you can do is start to identify what percentage are they starting to break down their posture. So now you've got this safety net of saying, okay, at 70%, you're fine. As soon as you went over, you started going into hyperextension, your hip position changed. So your kind of target and your aim for progression is to be able to maintain that posture over 70%.
Mm.
What are we going to do as a support team to ensure you're able to do that? That then becomes the next question. And what can we do to monitor and test that you're moving in the right direction? And that's where some of our testing battery comes in.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking of too. And you mentioned like progressions of trying to get the feel and position correct, and then integrated within the classic lifts, the full lifts, and the variations and accessory movements. Um, how do you go about kind of navigating that space where if you've worked, as a coach, if you worked with a lot of athletes, you can watch an athlete perform a snatch or a clean, or maybe not, maybe a different movement. And then you can say, okay, here's a variation of that. Because you can do the classic lift, you should probably be able to do a hang snatch well, or a power snatch well, or a variation well, or an RDL. And
Mhm.
they can't quite maintain that same coordination. It's like when you change movements, it's like I can't quite figure out this new demand. So when you talk about progressions of being able to kind of get into the right, set position, find what you'd call like a neutral kind of spine position, how do you, I guess, help the athlete navigate that with the changing demands of different movements? Because, having taught, now a lot of kids how to like RDL and hinge and deadlift, you can do, maybe a split stance RDL well, and you go to like a bilateral kind of feet parallel stance RDL, and then it changes a little bit. And you're like, okay, so it's not just like a one-to-one thing where I can do it in this variation, I can do it in that variation. So how do you navigate that kind of changing landscape of coordination demands?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer, I think, because you want variation in your ability to
Mm,
coordinate your body in different positions, right? And I think we use a terminology like working within a corridor. We
mm,
want the corridor to be wide, but ideally the best of us will operate right through the middle because you'd very rarely have to deviate
mm,
because you are that good at your skill. But every now and then, you might end up going, bouncing off the wall either side. So you would have watched people lift some really heavy weights and they can
mm,
save the lift, and you're like,
right.
how have they done that? It's
Yeah.
because they've got wide corridor to do that.
Mm,
But what I mean by wide corridor, they've got the physical capacity that enables them to do that, and they've got a coordinated pattern to reorganize themselves in a safe way to stand back up with that weight and then jerk it, or whatever the lift is, right? So I think like progressing some of the, let's just call them like compound exercises for now. Um, I would try and start them in a position where they're able to be neutral and it's pain free. So let's say we went for a hang clean instead of I mean, I'm sure most people do this anyway. Most people stand up all the way and then go down into the hang.
mm,
Okay. When you're standing up, have you got a neutral spine? Yes. Okay. As you go down to your mid thigh, have you still got that neutral spine? Yes. Okay. Now you can go lower. You know, now if you were to do a dead stop, so you stop at top of knee and then you went,
mm,
or below knee and you went, and they can maintain it, fantastic. Now let's say you utilize a counter movement where they're going to be descending at a faster velocity. Can they now maintain that posture with a higher velocity? No. Right. What sort of, well, firstly, what's the risk reward ratio or risk reward benefit, I suppose? Um, and also, do we need to put an intervention in place to make them better at being able to maintain that position when you're adding a velocity in by
mm,
using a counter movement
yeah.
during a hang snatch or a hang clean? So I think it's very context driven, which is such a cop out answer for everything. But unfortunately, I feel like it is the answer for most things. Um, so yeah, that I think that's how I would and have approached it. And I'm sure others have maybe some better ways of approaching it for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing that kind of comes to mind with that corridor example is I was thinking of like throwing darts, and you generally want to always aim for a bullseye. But if you're a little off the
Yeah.
mark, you need to be really good at hitting like a low score position on the board. So it's like we always
Yeah.
want to aim for the middle, but if we're not hitting the middle, we need to be able to also target the periphery of the board. And that's kind of like snatch, clean jerk should be always locked in, slotted. But when you got to reach for that extra point and take it, duck walk it out, you should be able to duck walk. You should be able to like twist and turn and whatever, and like, safely, of course, but like be a little gritty. And
Yeah,
then,
for sure. For
yeah,
sure. I think that's the one thing is really nice. I'm not often on social media. Um, and if I'm not liking like memes or videos of dogs, then normally I like the ones where weightlifters or strength athletes are training in a way which isn't just the barbell, but they're actually doing some unilateral work.
right.
They're doing some um, the bamboo bar work, for
Mm,
example. They're doing some rotational work, although their sport doesn't require that rotation. And like, well, you you might be a fantastic weightlifter, but to be an even better weightlifter, you need to be a really good athlete.
right.
And to be a good athlete, you need to have a really good level of competency of movement and strong in positions where you might not have to be in them all the time.
Mm,
But for health and for your protection, but also general strength,
yeah.
it's good to explore those movements. And I think that's something um, that certainly in the sport of weightlifting, it'd be good to see more of
Mm,
is working in rotation, doing more unilateral um, lower body work, for example, and kind of pairing that together. Doesn't have to be loads, but at least some exposure might help protect us and keep the back a bit more healthy because the amount of axile loading we go through is phenomenal. Um, and that's just part of the sport because the sport is, outcome driven.
mm, yeah. No, I think that's a great example of kind of what I've been pulling more from the strength and conditioning world is, a high, just a big toolbox of exercises, and saying like, okay, if maybe you squat and you have, knee valgus and you have a hard time kind of keeping the knees over the, over the feet, maybe we do some more like lateral lunges or squats where we kind of step to the side and then get that like lateral push. And I found for me that's just help, even if it's
Nice.
just from kind of appropriate proprioceptive standpoint of like, oh, I really have to drive hard off the lateral side of my foot. Um, then when I squat, I feel like I can keep more even pressure and be more kind of locked in rather than just kind of, what I would call like lose my legs as I stand up, just kind of lose a sense of where my legs are in space and just try to not die with the barbell on my back. So I think that like big toolbox, it keeps things fresh and fun. You have longer progressions, probably more complicated or built out progressions. And then it also, as you mentioned, creates probably a more robust person who, whatever you don't need at the end of the day, like it's kind of the training goes from general to specific. Whatever you don't need is kind of get weeded out eventually to optimize for performance. But I think it's never going to hurt to have that stuff like in your back pocket or to start with.
Of
Um,
course.
so I love that message. I think it's great.
Yeah, I'm interested to know. Like, I think it's really cool the way you've used the example of the lateral lunge. Like,
Mm,
where would you put that in your program or in your session? So, would that be at the beginning? Would it be in the middle, the end, and why? Because I think people have different thoughts.
yeah.
And again, I know the answer is going to be context specific,
Sure.
but I'd like to know what you do and what your context is.
Yeah, maybe this is getting me thinking of like putting at the start of a session as a kind of a movement primer because I've been doing this thing, and it's funny because we get these like boxes of for the weightlifting movements you can do technique primers and you can have like exercises kind of building into a snatch, but you may not think about doing that for like a squat or a press or something because you're just like you take it for granted. It's like, oh, it's a slower movement, therefore it's easier, therefore I don't need as much like movement priming. But with a snatch, I've kind of gotten to this what I would call like a staging primers is we'll start maybe with like a no contact muscle snatch, and then we might go with like a slow pull or like a tempo power snatch, maybe with no foot movement, and then we'll go into the main snatch work for the day. So it's like, okay, we have 3 exercises dedicated to a variation of the snatch, all increasing in load, all increasing in simplicity, and yeah, I'd say technical simplicity, so we can optimize for like technique, technique load, and then purely load kind of at the back end. And then we might even do a pull after the fact. So you have 4 exercises dedicated to either load or coordination. And then, with the squat, it's like, oh, we'll just squat. We'll just, whatever, and we'll do enough volume or we'll slow it down. But I found that with unilateral exercises, I've been kind of putting those on non-squatting days, kind of at the end of a session, just because, I did like 4 sets of 5 in the tempo squat yesterday, and my legs were absolutely blown up after that. So I think, having it on alternate days where you aren't squatting, or even, yeah, putting it as a warm up, maybe you do, lateral lunges up and back down a strip of turf or something. Maybe you load it a little bit, maybe you have a slower cadence. And I think just having that like ability to think about explosive drive kind of off the outside of the foot, I think for me helps create more shape to my squat and my feet. Like it create a better arch, just get better position down and up. So I haven't tried it differently, but now I'm kind of curious to know how that would fit in.
It's interesting, like the way you've just described it there, putting it first. I feel like as humans, we have this natural tendency of, if it's at the beginning of the session, it's probably more important.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's something the performance manager and our head of performance services do really well, is they've started to integrate that really early in the programming for athletes. So it becomes a priority. And of course, that priority changes the closer you get to competition.
Right.
Priority number 1 is always going to be stay healthy, because your best ability is your availability.
Yeah.
So my program's only as effective as your ability to be able to conduct it
Right.
down to
Yeah.
a T, right? So I think I also think, going back to our earlier conversation about learning, and you're saying using the lateral lunges down the turf, for example, and pushing off on the outside of the foot, that now becomes almost like a learning segue for the bigger compound lift of the back squat. So then maybe over time, it's not about creating the adaptation using those lateral lunges, but actually it's about getting the athlete to learn where the weight distribution needs to be, where the knee needs to be relative to the foot. And then because they're better at doing that, they can now get more out of the squat.
Right. Well, and I think that's really important, because when we think about like people getting banged up, it can be just, oh, you're doing way too much work. You're kind of getting, kind of run through the garbage disposal. It could also be getting out of position. And it's like, oh, if you consistently get out of position because in the squat you can't use your legs effectively, or in the snatch your hips hike up, and suddenly, you're getting way more work to your lower back. It's not that that's problematic. It's just like the dosing is going to be all off, because you programmed, 50 reps of a snatch to work the snatch. Now you're going to getting a little bit just overindulging in the low back and hips. So you're not able to kind of distribute that stress as it's needed to be distributed. So I think from just like a longevity standpoint, making the adaptations we want, feeling more comfortable and confident in our movement. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I love that idea of, starting with the thing that's most important. And to kind of round out, I'll just say this. I'm known for a long time, some of my athletes aren't the most strong, weightlifters. And I never had them squat first to start a session. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to overhaul this. I know your legs are not the strong suit. So we're going to squat first and then do our weightlifting. And lo and behold, they hit squat PRs. They got slower. Okay. So that means now we have, 9 weeks, 10 weeks until our next major competition. So let's move squatting to behind the snatches and clean and jerks. Let's do more weightlifting. get some
Nice.
speed back and put that leg strength to good use. And I think that like adaptability, being able to target, what are the kind of like bottlenecks, and then saying, but it's not the bottleneck anymore, or at least it doesn't
Yes.
feel like it. So let's like change things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah. Coaching is fun, man. Coaching is fun. I love it.
It's always a challenge,
Yeah.
always a challenge.
Always
And
a challenge. And, we're coming up on the hour mark. For people who are interested in checking out all the work you do, all the great work you do, where can they go to find your papers, find any other resource? Obviously, they can listen to you present at the Power and Strength Summit. Again, that's January 24th and 25th. But if they want to just kind of indulge, in all the scientific writings you've done, where can they find that?
yeah, so you can find it on ResearchGate just by searching my name, so Shyam Chavdar. Drop me an email. I'm more than happy to communicate via that if people have any questions. And social media platforms, so Instagram, coach_Chavda, uh, X, shy_to tweet, and I think that's pretty much it for social media platforms, and LinkedIn, obviously my name. So I'm more than happy to send out any papers, or answer any questions should people have them.
Yeah, awesome. And I would, highly recommend people go check all of his work, all of your work out. And if you have something you want to ask him questions about, and maybe something that could be beneficial from research standpoint or just a personal curiosity standpoint, I'd highly recommend that. If you're interested in keeping up with me, you can find me on Instagram at Josh_Phil WL. That's PHILWL. Philosophical weightlifting on Instagram as well, and everywhere else. Thank you all for tuning in to another fantastic episode of the podcast. We will catch you all next time.